Blood has a way of betraying you when you least expect it, and Ruth Washington learned this truth in 3 devastating seconds at the Plaza Hotel. The champagne glass slipped from her trembling fingers, golden liquid arcing through the air in slow motion before splashing across Ashley Sullivan's pristine wedding gown. The $50,000 Vera Wang masterpiece, hand-sewn pearls, imported French lace, 2 years of meticulous planning, now bore the unmistakable stain of Ruth's clumsiness. Time stopped. 300 guests turned as one, their sophisticated chatter dying instantly. In the suffocating silence, Ruth watched Ashley's face transform from bridal radiance to fury so pure it seemed to burn the air between them. "You worthless nobody," Ashley whispered, her voice carrying the kind of venom that could kill. The slap came without warning. Ashley's manicured hand connected with Ruth's cheek, with a crack that echoed through the plaza's grand ballroom like a gunshot. The force sent Ruth stumbling backward, her own glass shattering against marble imported from Italian quarries. Pain radiated across Ruth's face, but the physical blow was nothing compared to the devastating realization washing over her. Every phone in the room had emerged simultaneously, recording her humiliation for eternal posterity. Tomorrow's social media feeds would feast on this moment. The nobody sister-in-law who'd destroyed Manhattan royalty's perfect wedding. "How dare you!" Ashley screamed, her composure shattered like crystal. "This is my day, my moment, and you destroyed everything." Ruth's hand flew to her burning cheek, fighting back tears that would only provide more entertainment for the vultures surrounding them. She'd survived 3 years in this world of inherited privilege and casual cruelty, but tonight she finally understood her place in their hierarchy. She was expendable. "Ashley, please," Ruth managed, her voice barely audible above the excited murmurs. "It was an accident." "An accident?" Ashley's laugh was hysterical, unhinged. "Nothing you do is an accident. You've been trying to ruin this family since you trapped my brother into marriage." Ruth's eyes found Michael across the chaos, her husband of 3 years, the man who'd sworn to love and protect her. Their gazes met, and she saw something flicker in his expression. For one desperate moment, she thought he might defend her. Instead, Michael Sullivan chose his bloodline over his marriage vows. "Ruth," his voice cut through the ballroom's tension like a blade through skin. "Get out, now." The words hit her harder than Ashley's slap. Her own husband, the man who'd whispered promises of forever just that morning, was publicly abandoning her when she needed him most. "Michael," she breathed, unable to believe the betrayal unfolding. "You heard him." Patricia Sullivan's voice dripped satisfaction. Michael's mother had been waiting 3 years for this moment, and her smile was sharp enough to draw blood. "You never belonged here anyway." Ruth stood frozen in the ballroom's center, surrounded by Manhattan's elite, who watched her destruction with the fascination of Romans at gladiatorial games. Every face showed the same expression, not sympathy, but entertainment. They were witnessing the fall of someone who dared to climb above her station. But as her carefully constructed world crumbled, Ruth's attention was drawn to an unexpected sight. Near the ballroom's back wall, partially hidden behind a marble column, stood a woman who didn't belong among the tuxedos and evening gowns. Detective Samantha Hayes. The badge was discreetly concealed beneath a designer blazer that probably cost more than most people's rent. But Ruth recognized the predatory stillness of law enforcement. Their eyes met across the sea of onlookers, and Ruth's blood turned to ice. The detective who'd been hunting her for 3 years had finally tracked her down. Ruth's mind raced back to her life as Rebecca Lewis, the brilliant financial analyst who'd gotten caught up in Gerald Morrison's embezzlement scheme, who'd stolen $4 million before disappearing into a carefully constructed new identity. She'd thought Ruth Washington was untouchable, protected by marriage and social position. She'd been catastrophically wrong. Detective Hayes didn't move, didn't signal, didn't create a scene. She simply watched with the patience of a predator who knew her prey had nowhere left to run. The detective had aged since Ruth last saw her, silver threading through dark hair, new lines around intelligent eyes, but her determination burned as bright as ever. The irony was devastating. Ruth had survived Morrison's downfall, evaded federal investigation, and built a new life among New York's financial elite. She'd even married into one of the city's most prominent families. And now she was being destroyed by champagne and family politics before the law could even reach her. But as Ruth stood there with her cheek burning and her marriage dying in front of 300 witnesses, she noticed something else. Tyler Jameson, the groom whose wedding she'd just disrupted, was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Unlike everyone else in the room, Tyler didn't look amused by her humiliation. If anything, he seemed concerned, protective even. It made no sense. Tyler barely knew her beyond polite family gatherings. Why would he care about her destruction? "I should go," Ruth said quietly, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. "Yes, you should," Patricia agreed with vicious satisfaction. "Security will escort you out." But before hotel security could approach, Tyler Jameson stepped forward. "Actually," the groom said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "that won't be necessary." Ashley stared at her new husband like he'd grown a second head. "Tyler, what are you doing?" "I'm suggesting we all take a breath," Tyler replied calmly. "This is supposed to be a celebration of love, not a public execution." His words hung in the air like a challenge. The crowd sensed new drama brewing, and phones shifted to capture whatever would happen next. Patricia's eyes narrowed. "Tyler, dear, perhaps you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Tyler interrupted, and something in his tone made Ruth look at him more carefully. "I understand that accidents happen, families overreact, and sometimes the wrong person gets blamed for problems that run much deeper." There was a subtext in his words that Ruth couldn't decipher, but she could see it registering with the Sullivan family. Michael's face had gone pale, and Patricia's confident smirk was wavering. "What's that supposed to mean?" Ashley demanded. Tyler's smile was enigmatic. "It means that before we destroy someone's reputation over spilled champagne, perhaps we should consider whether our own reputations can survive the scrutiny that tends to follow such public displays." Ruth felt her heart racing for a different reason now. Tyler was protecting her, but why? And what did he know about the Sullivan family that could make them back down? Detective Hayes was still watching from across the room, but now she seemed focused on Tyler rather than Ruth. The detective's expression suggested she was processing new information, recalculating her approach. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tyler announced to the crowd, "I think we've all had enough excitement for one evening. Perhaps we should move on to the reception and leave family matters to be resolved privately." It was a masterful deflection, offering the crowd an exit from the drama while giving the Sullivan family a chance to avoid further embarrassment. But Ruth could see the calculation in Tyler's eyes, the way he was studying reactions and filing away information. This wasn't random kindness. Tyler Jameson was playing a game with rules Ruth didn't understand. As the crowd began to disperse, murmuring among themselves about the night's entertainment, Ruth realized her life had just changed irrevocably. Her marriage was over, her cover might be blown, and Detective Hayes was closing in. But Tyler Jameson, a man she barely knew, had just risked his own wedding reception to protect her. The question was, why? Chapter 2. Secrets in the Shadows. The past never stays buried forever, and Detective Samantha Hayes had been patient enough to let it surface naturally. Ruth's heart hammered against her ribs as she processed Tyler's unexpected intervention. Around them, the plaza's grand ballroom slowly returned to its previous elegance as guests migrated toward the reception area, their phones still buzzing with hastily posted videos of the evening's drama. But Detective Hayes remained exactly where she'd been, watching everything with the focused intensity of someone building a case. Ruth's mind spiraled back 5 years to when she'd been Rebecca Lewis, a Columbia Business School graduate drowning in student debt and desperate for survival in Manhattan's financial jungle. She'd started at Morrison & Associates as a legitimate analyst, brilliant enough to spot discrepancies that others missed, ambitious enough to want more than her meager salary could provide. The first red flag had been Mrs. Chen's retirement account. The 73-year-old seamstress had saved for 40 years, trusting Morrison with her life savings. When Rebecca noticed the missing funds, she'd initially assumed it was a clerical error, until she found 17 more just like it. Gerald Morrison had been stealing from elderly clients for years, moving money through shell companies and offshore accounts with the sophistication of someone who'd perfected the art of invisible theft. Teachers, firefighters, nurses, people who'd worked their entire lives only to have their futures stolen by a man in a $5,000 suit. Rebecca had faced a choice: report Morrison and watch him destroy her career with one phone call to his powerful connections, or stay quiet and become complicit in crimes that would devastate innocent families. She'd chosen a third option. Working nights and weekends, Rebecca had learned Morrison's system from the inside. She'd documented every theft, traced every transaction, built an airtight case that could withstand federal scrutiny. But more importantly, she'd figured out how to beat him at his own game. The first recovery had been Mrs. Chen's account. Rebecca used Morrison's own methods to trace the stolen funds, then systematically returned them with enough additional compensation to cover the interest Mrs. Chen should have earned. She told herself it was justice, not theft. But justice had required resources Morrison's legitimate accounts couldn't provide. So Rebecca Lewis had become a different kind of criminal, one who stole from the thieves to protect the victims. For 18 months, she'd operated a one-woman financial vigilante operation using Morrison's stolen money to compensate his victims while building evidence for his eventual downfall. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd become everything she'd wanted to stop. Detective Hayes had been assigned to the case when Morrison's victims started reporting the mysterious restitution payments. Samantha Hayes was legendary in financial crimes, a former forensic accountant who joined the NYPD specifically to hunt white-collar criminals who thought they were untouchable. Hayes had spent 2 years unraveling Morrison's operation thread by thread. When Morrison was finally arrested, he'd tried to pin everything on Rebecca, claiming she was the mastermind and he was merely her puppet. But Rebecca Lewis had vanished 3 weeks before the arrests. She'd used every trick she'd learned from Morrison's playbook to create Ruth Washington, a complete identity backed by carefully forged documents and meticulously constructed digital footprints. The $4 million she'd borrowed from Morrison's accounts had been transformed into legitimate investments that would fund her new life. Ruth Washington was born conservative and careful, someone who would attract the right kind of man and blend seamlessly into high society. She'd studied their mannerisms, learned their speech patterns, mastered the subtle signals that marked someone as belonging to their exclusive world. Meeting Michael Sullivan had been calculated but not planned. The charity gala for underprivileged children, she still cringed at the irony, had been chosen because financial sector executives attended without their wives, making it perfect hunting ground for a woman looking to marry into legitimacy. Michael had been exactly what she'd needed: handsome enough to be believable, successful enough to provide protection, and most importantly, trusting enough to never question her carefully constructed background. Their courtship had been a masterpiece of manipulation disguised as romance. Ruth had let Michael pursue her, presenting just enough mystery to intrigue him while staying safe enough to avoid deeper investigation. She'd been the perfect girlfriend, beautiful, intelligent, supportive, but never demanding enough to become inconvenient. The wedding had been Ruth's graduation ceremony from criminal to respectable wife. As Mrs. Michael Sullivan, she'd thought herself untouchable. For 3 years, she'd played the role perfectly. She'd endured Patricia's subtle cruelties and Ashley's open disdain because they were the price of safety. She'd diminished herself to fit their expectations because invisibility was survival. But now, standing in the plaza ballroom, with her cheek still burning from Ashley's slap, Ruth realized her perfect disguise had become a perfect prison. "Ruth," Tyler's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. "Are you all right?" She looked up to find the groom studying her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. There was something in his expression that suggested he saw more than she wanted him to see. "I'm fine," she lied, acutely aware that Detective Hayes was still watching from across the room. "I should probably go." "Actually," Tyler said quietly, "I think we need to talk. Privately." Before Ruth could respond, Michael appeared beside them, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Tyler, I'm sorry about this," Michael said, not looking at Ruth. "My wife has a tendency to create problems." The dismissal hit Ruth like a physical blow. Her husband of 3 years was reducing her to a problem to be managed, an embarrassment to be minimized. "Interesting," Tyler replied, his tone carefully neutral, "because from where I was standing, it looked like your wife was the victim of an unprovoked attack." Michael's face darkened. "Ashley was upset about her dress." "Ashley assaulted someone over an accident," Tyler corrected. "There's a difference." Ruth stared at Tyler in amazement. No one had defended her in 3 years of Sullivan family gatherings. Why was he starting now? "Look," Michael said, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. "Ruth apologizes for disrupting your wedding. We'll pay for Ashley's dress, of course, and—" "I don't want an apology," Tyler interrupted. "I want to understand why a family would choose to publicly humiliate one of their own instead of handling an accident with grace." The question hung in the air like an accusation. Ruth could see Patricia approaching from across the room, her expression suggesting she'd heard enough of this conversation. "Tyler, dear," Patricia said as she joined them, her voice dripping false sweetness, "I think you're misunderstanding the situation. Ruth has always been difficult to integrate into our family dynamic." "How so?" Tyler asked. Patricia's smile was razor-sharp. "Well, she's never been entirely forthcoming about her background, has she? We know so little about her family, her education, her previous relationships." Ruth felt ice forming in her veins. Patricia was fishing, probing for reactions that might confirm whatever suspicions she harbored about her daughter-in-law's mysterious past. "That's interesting," Tyler said thoughtfully, "because I've always found Ruth to be remarkably well-informed about financial markets, quite sophisticated in her understanding of complex economic systems." It was a trap disguised as a compliment, and Ruth recognized it immediately. Tyler was testing her, seeing how she'd respond to attention being drawn to knowledge she shouldn't possess. "I read a lot," Ruth said carefully. "Do you?" Tyler's smile was enigmatic. "What would you recommend for someone interested in learning about, say, international money laundering?" The question was so specific, so pointed, that Ruth felt her breath catch. Around them, the conversation continued, as if Tyler had asked about book clubs or restaurant recommendations, but Ruth heard the subtext clearly. Tyler knew. Somehow, some way, Tyler Jameson knew exactly who she was and what she'd done. The question was, what did he plan to do about it? Before Ruth could respond, hotel security appeared beside their group. "Excuse me," the lead officer said politely, "but we've received reports of a disturbance. Is everything resolved here?" "Completely resolved," Tyler said smoothly. "Just a minor family disagreement. Nothing that requires any official intervention." The security officer nodded and withdrew, but Ruth noticed Detective Hayes had moved closer during the brief exchange. The detective was now within earshot, close enough to intervene if the situation escalated. "Well," Patricia said with false cheer, "I think we should all move on to the reception. This unpleasantness has gone on quite long enough." "Agreed," Tyler said. "Ruth, would you like to join us? I believe we have much to discuss." It wasn't really a question, and Ruth recognized a command when she heard one. Tyler Jameson, heir to one of Manhattan's largest real estate fortunes, was not a man accustomed to being refused. But more importantly, Detective Hayes was watching their every interaction, and any attempt to flee would only confirm suspicions that Ruth desperately needed to avoid. "Of course," Ruth said, accepting Tyler's offered arm. "I'd be honored." As they walked toward the reception area, Ruth realized she was caught between multiple dangerous forces: a detective who'd spent years hunting her, a husband who just publicly abandoned her, and a groom who somehow knew her darkest secrets. The question was, which one would destroy her first? Chapter 3. The weight of truth power reveals itself in the space between accusation and proof, and Tyler Jameson was about to demonstrate why he'd become Manhattan's most dangerous businessman before his 30th birthday. The plaza's reception hall glittered with enough crystal and gold to fund a small country, but Ruth felt like she was walking through a minefield. Every step carried the potential for devastation. Every conversation threatened to expose secrets that could destroy multiple lives. Tyler guided her through the crowd with practiced ease, his hand on her elbow both protective and possessive. Around them, Manhattan's elite had returned to their natural habitat. Clusters of power brokers discussing deals that would reshape the financial landscape, socialites comparing acquisitions that cost more than most people's homes, and politicians whose decisions affected millions of lives. Ruth had spent 3 years learning to navigate these waters, but tonight she felt like a drowning woman whose life preserver had just been revealed as an anchor. "Mr. Jameson," a voice called out from behind them, "congratulations on the wedding." Ruth turned to see Jonathan Pierce approaching with a smile that never reached his eyes. She recognized him immediately, one of Morrison's biggest victims, the man whose construction company's pension fund had been decimated by the embezzlement scheme that had made Rebecca Lewis both criminal and crusader. Her blood turned to ice as Jonathan's gaze settled on her face with unmistakable recognition. "Thank you, Jonathan," Tyler replied smoothly. "I don't believe you've met my sister-in-law, Ruth Sullivan." Jonathan's smile sharpened to a blade's edge. "Actually, I believe we've met before, though she was using a different name at the time." Ruth felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Jonathan Pierce had found her, recognized her, and was about to expose everything in front of Detective Hayes, Tyler, and 300 witnesses. "I'm sorry," Ruth said carefully, "but I think you have me confused with someone else." "Do I?" Jonathan's voice carried the confidence of a man holding winning cards. "Because you look remarkably similar to a young woman named Rebecca Lewis who used to work for Gerald Morrison, the same Rebecca Lewis who stole $4 million from my employee's pension fund." The accusation hung in the air like a live grenade with the pin pulled. Ruth could see Detective Hayes moving closer through the crowd, her trained instincts recognizing the scent of revelation. But Tyler's response surprised everyone. "That's a serious accusation, Jonathan," Tyler said calmly. "I hope you have evidence to support it." Jonathan's confidence faltered slightly. "Well, the resemblance is unmistakable." "Resemblance isn't evidence," Tyler observed, "and false accusations of criminal activity can constitute slander, particularly when made in front of witnesses." Ruth stared at Tyler in amazement. He wasn't just protecting her, he was actively undermining Jonathan's credibility with surgical precision. "Are you suggesting I'm lying?" Jonathan demanded. "I'm suggesting you're mistaken," Tyler replied. "But if you'd like to pursue this officially, I'm sure Detective Hayes would be happy to hear your concerns." Tyler gestured toward the approaching detective, and Ruth's heart nearly stopped. He was deliberately drawing law enforcement into the conversation, the exact opposite of what someone protecting a fugitive should do, unless Tyler knew something she didn't. Detective Hayes joined their circle with professional composure, but Ruth could see the predatory alertness in her eyes. "Gentlemen, Mrs. Sullivan," Hayes said with a polite nod, "is there some kind of problem here?" "Mr. Pierce believes he recognizes Mrs. Sullivan from somewhere," Tyler explained helpfully. "He seems to think she resembles someone involved in a financial crime case." Hayes studied Jonathan with the expression of someone who'd dealt with countless civilian witnesses over the years. "Is that so, Mr. Pierce?" Jonathan straightened, sensing his moment. "Detective, this woman is Rebecca Lewis. She worked for Gerald Morrison and stole millions from pension funds. I've been looking for her for 3 years. "That's quite an accusation," Hayes said thoughtfully. "What evidence do you have to support this identification?" Jonathan's confidence began to crumble under professional scrutiny. "Well, she looks exactly like her. The facial structure, the height, everything matches." "Physical resemblance isn't sufficient for criminal identification," Hayes replied. "Do you have any other evidence? Fingerprints, documents, witness testimony?" She was at Morrison's office during the relevant time period. She had access to the accounts that were compromised." Hayes pulled out a small notebook and began writing. "I see. And when did you last see this Rebecca Lewis person?" "About 4 years ago, before she disappeared." "So you're basing this identification on a 4-year-old memory of someone you may have seen occasionally in an office setting?" Jonathan was beginning to realize his accusation was falling apart under detective scrutiny. "Detective, I'm telling you, this is her. I'm absolutely certain." "Mr. Pierce," Hayes said, with the patience of someone who'd handled hundreds of similar situations, "I've been investigating the Morrison case for 3 years. I know every detail, every piece of evidence, every witness statement. If Mrs. Sullivan were Rebecca Lewis, I would have identified her long ago." Ruth felt like she was in an alternate universe where Detective Hayes, the woman who'd spent years hunting her, was protecting her from exposure. "But," Jonathan protested. "Furthermore," Hayes continued, "Rebecca Lewis has been accounted for. We have evidence placing her in several different locations over the past 3 years, none of which involve Manhattan high society." It was a lie, a complete fabrication, and Ruth couldn't understand why Detective Hayes was telling it. Tyler stepped forward with what appeared to be helpful concern. "Jonathan, I think you're letting your trauma from the Morrison case affect your judgment. It's understandable. What happened to your employees was terrible. But you can't go around accusing innocent people of crimes based on superficial resemblance." "This isn't superficial," Jonathan began. "Actually," Tyler interrupted, "it is. Because if you'd done any research before making these accusations, you would know that Ruth Sullivan has been a prominent member of Manhattan society for 3 years. She's married to Michael Sullivan, daughter-in-law to Patricia Sullivan, and well-known in charitable circles." Tyler pulled out his phone and began scrolling through screens. "Here are photos of Ruth at the Metropolitan Museum Gala 2 years ago, the Children's Hospital benefit last spring, the Mayor's Economic Development Dinner 6 months ago, all documented, all verifiable, all during the time period when you claim she was hiding under an assumed identity." Ruth stared at Tyler in amazement. He was systematically destroying Jonathan's credibility with evidence she didn't know existed. Detective Hayes examined Tyler's phone with professional interest. "These do appear to be authentic social media posts and news photographs spanning several years. Mr. Pierce, are you suggesting that Mrs. Sullivan has been maintaining an elaborate false identity for 3 years while actively participating in Manhattan's most visible social circles?" When presented with the logical implications of his accusation, Jonathan's certainty began to waver. Maybe I was mistaken about the timeline. Or maybe you were mistaken about the identification," Tyler suggested gently. "It happens more often than people think. Trauma can affect memory in unexpected ways." Detective Hayes closed her notebook with finality. "Mr. Pierce, I understand your desire to see justice for what happened to your employees, but false accusations help no one. If you have actual evidence of criminal activity, please contact my office through proper channels." As Hayes walked away and Jonathan retreated in defeat, Ruth found herself alone with Tyler among 300 strangers. "Thank you," she said quietly. Tyler's smile was enigmatic. "For what?" "For protecting me from a false accusation." "Was it false?" Tyler asked, and his question carried weight that made Ruth's chest tighten. Before Ruth could respond, Tyler continued, "Because here's what I find interesting, Ruth. Jonathan Pierce was absolutely right about your identity. You are Rebecca Lewis. You did work for Morrison, and you were involved in the financial crimes that destroyed his pension fund." Ruth felt the world tilting beneath her feet. "Tyler." "But," Tyler continued smoothly, "Jonathan Pierce is also a desperate man who's been hunting the wrong target for 3 years, because Rebecca Lewis wasn't the criminal in the Morrison case." Tyler leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "She was the hero." The revelation hit Ruth like lightning. Tyler didn't just know who she was, he knew what she'd really done. Somehow, someway, he'd uncovered the truth that even Detective Hayes had missed. "How?" Ruth breathed. Tyler's smile was full of secrets. "Because, Rebecca, I've been looking for you almost as long as Jonathan Pierce has. The difference is, I knew what I was really looking for. And what was that? The woman who saved my mother's life." The words hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Tyler Jameson, heir to billions, groom at the social event of the season, had just revealed a connection to her past that changed everything. "I don't understand," Ruth whispered. "You will," Tyler promised. "But first, we need to get you away from here, because Detective Hayes may be protecting you tonight, but there are other people at this reception who won't be so understanding when they realize who you really are." As if summoned by his words, Patricia Sullivan appeared beside them, her expression calculating and cold. "Tyler, dear," she said with false sweetness, "I couldn't help but notice your conversation with that unpleasant Pierce man. I hope Ruth hasn't been telling stories about her mysterious past." It was a fishing expedition disguised as social concern, and Ruth recognized the trap immediately. "Actually," Tyler replied, "Ruth and I were just discussing how dangerous it can be when people make assumptions about others based on incomplete information." Patricia's smile sharpened. "How true. Although sometimes incomplete information is all we have to work with, isn't it? Particularly when certain people are reluctant to share details about their backgrounds." The accusation was subtle, but unmistakable. Patricia Sullivan suspected her daughter-in-law of hiding something significant, and she was using Tyler's wedding reception to probe for weakness. "Mrs. Sullivan," Tyler said thoughtfully, "are you suggesting that my sister-in-law has been dishonest about her past?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Patricia replied. "I'm simply observing that some people seem to prefer keeping their histories private." Tyler nodded, as if considering this carefully. "You know, that's interesting. Because in my experience, the people most concerned about others' privacy are usually the ones with the most to hide themselves." The words hit Patricia like a slap. Her composed mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something that looked like fear. "I'm not sure what you're implying," Patricia began. "I'm not implying anything," Tyler said, with a smile that could have frozen champagne. "I'm simply observing that glass houses make poor platforms for throwing stones." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Tyler was warning Patricia that attacking Ruth would bring unwanted scrutiny to the Sullivan family's own secrets. But Ruth could see the calculation in Patricia's eyes. The older woman was weighing risks and benefits, considering whether destroying Ruth was worth whatever consequences Tyler might unleash. And Ruth realized with growing horror that Patricia Sullivan was exactly the kind of person who would burn down her own house if it meant destroying her enemies. Chapter 4. Masks Fall Away. Truth is a weapon that cuts both ways, and Tyler Jameson was about to prove why the most dangerous people are those with nothing left to lose. The reception hall had transformed into a battlefield, disguised as a celebration. Beneath the crystal chandeliers and golden light, power games played out with smiles and champagne toasts, each conversation a chess match where the stakes were reputations, fortunes, and lives. Ruth felt like she was drowning in implications. Tyler knew her identity. Detective Hayes was protecting her for unknown reasons, and Patricia Sullivan was circling like a shark who'd scented blood in the water. "Patricia," Tyler said, with the kind of smile that made billion-dollar deals collapse, "I think we need to have a conversation about family loyalty." "Do we?" Patricia's voice carried 3 decades of social warfare experience. "We do. Because families protect each other, don't they? They keep secrets safe, they present united fronts, and they certainly don't air private matters in public venues." Tyler's words were carefully chosen, each one designed to remind Patricia that she was standing in a room full of Manhattan's most influential gossips. Whatever secrets the Sullivan family harbored could be exposed just as easily as Ruth's. "Of course, families protect each other," Patricia agreed carefully. "Excellent. Then I'm sure you'll want to protect Ruth from any further misunderstandings this evening." It was diplomacy wrapped around a threat. Tyler was offering Patricia a face-saving exit while making it clear that continued attacks on Ruth would bring consequences she wouldn't enjoy. But Patricia Sullivan hadn't survived 4 decades in Manhattan society by backing down from challenges. "Tyler, dear," she said with venomous sweetness, "you're young and romantic. It's natural that you'd want to see the best in people, but sometimes family protection requires acknowledging when someone doesn't belong." The attack was masterful, questioning Tyler's judgment while positioning herself as the voice of wisdom and experience. Ruth could see heads turning throughout the reception area as nearby conversations died and attention focused on their increasingly tense exchange. Tyler's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. Ruth recognized it immediately from business news coverage. It was the same stance Tyler Jameson adopted just before destroying competitors who'd underestimated him. "Belonging," Tyler repeated thoughtfully. "That's interesting. Tell me, Patricia, what qualifies someone to belong in this family?" "Shared values, certainly. Similar backgrounds. Transparency about one's past." "I see. And would those same standards apply to everyone in the family?" Patricia's confidence flickered. "Of course." Tyler pulled out his phone with casual precision. "Because I've been doing some research into the Sullivan family history. Fascinating reading, really." Ruth watched Patricia's face cycle through emotions. Confusion, concern, and finally, carefully controlled fear. "What kind of research?" Patricia asked. "Financial records mainly, corporate filings, bank statements, investment patterns, the kind of documentation that tells the real story of how families build their wealth." Tyler swiped through screens with practiced efficiency. "For instance, I discovered that Sullivan and Associates nearly went bankrupt 5 years ago. Quite extensively, actually. Your client base had evaporated, your investments had failed catastrophically, and you were perhaps 6 months away from complete financial collapse." The color began draining from Patricia's face. "But then," Tyler continued conversationally, "something miraculous happened. An anonymous investor appeared and saved your company. Someone injected enough capital not only to prevent bankruptcy, but to transform Sullivan and Associates into one of Manhattan's most profitable firms." Ruth stared at Tyler in amazement. She had no idea where he was getting this information, but Patricia's expression suggested every word was accurate. Anonymous investors aren't uncommon in financial recovery situations, Patricia said weakly. No, they're not, Tyler agreed. What's uncommon is anonymous investors who also happen to expose ongoing criminal activity within the companies they're saving. The words hung in the air like a live grenade. Ruth could see Detective Hayes moving closer through the crowd, her professional instincts alerting her to developing drama. Criminal activity. Patricia's voice had risen slightly. Embezzlement, specifically. Someone was stealing from client trust funds to cover gambling debts and failed personal investments. Quite systematically, actually. The anonymous investor not only stopped the theft, but recovered the stolen funds and returned them to victims. Tyler's phone showed financial documents that made Patricia take an involuntary step backward. The beautiful thing about digital banking, Tyler observed, is that everything leaves a trail. Every transaction, every transfer, every attempt to hide criminal activity behind shell companies and offshore accounts. Ruth felt like she was watching a masterclass in controlled demolition. Tyler was systematically destroying Patricia's credibility while revealing crimes that could send her to federal prison. But more importantly, Tyler was rewriting the narrative of Rebecca Lewis from criminal to hero. "What are you suggesting?" Patricia demanded. "I'm not suggesting anything," Tyler replied with deadly calm. "I'm stating facts. 5 years ago, Rebecca Lewis exposed a massive embezzlement scheme at Morrison & Associates. When she realized that other companies were conducting similar frauds, she used her skills to identify and stop them." Tyler turned to address the growing crowd of onlookers. "Ladies and gentlemen, you're in the presence of one of the most ethical people I've ever met. Rebecca Lewis spent 2 years of her life making sure that innocent victims of financial crimes were protected and compensated." The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembled guests. Phones emerged again, but this time they were recording Tyler's defense rather than Ruth's humiliation. "The woman you know as Ruth Sullivan," Tyler continued, "sacrificed her own safety and freedom to protect people like your grandparents, your employees, your friends who trusted criminals with their retirement savings." Ruth felt tears flowing down her face as Tyler transformed her story of shame into something resembling heroism. "But why hide?" someone called out from the crowd. Tyler's expression grew fierce. "Because whistleblowers get destroyed. They get sued into bankruptcy, blacklisted from their industries, and have their lives ruined by the very criminals they expose. Rebecca Lewis went into hiding because staying visible would have meant death threats, harassment, and retaliation from some very dangerous people." He gestured toward the crowd of Manhattan's elite. "How many of you work in financial services? How many of you manage other people's money? How many of you would want someone with Rebecca Lewis's skills and ethical standards examining your books?" The implication was devastating. Tyler was suggesting that some of the people in this very room might have reasons to fear someone like Rebecca Lewis. Detective Hayes had reached their group, and Ruth could see the detective processing Tyler's revelations with professional interest. "Mr. Jameson," Hayes said carefully, "are you saying that Mrs. Sullivan is Rebecca Lewis?" "I'm saying that my sister-in-law is a hero who deserves protection rather than persecution." Hayes nodded slowly. "And you have evidence supporting these claims?" "Boxes of it. Financial records, correspondence, documentation of recovered funds, testimonials from victims who were compensated for their losses." Tyler's phone buzzed with an incoming call, and he glanced at the screen before declining it. "In fact," he continued, "I've been working with federal authorities for months to document Rebecca Lewis's contributions to financial crime prevention. What she did wasn't criminal, it was law enforcement." Ruth stared at Tyler in shock. He'd been working with federal authorities. He'd known her identity for months. He'd been building a case not against her, but for her. "The question," Tyler said, addressing Patricia directly, is whether this family wants to be known for protecting heroes or persecuting them. It was the moment of truth, and Ruth could see Patricia calculating odds and consequences. Attacking Ruth now would mean challenging Tyler's version of events, which would invite scrutiny of the Sullivan family's own criminal activities. But backing down would mean accepting Ruth as family, which Patricia had spent 3 years trying to prevent. "This is quite a story," Patricia said carefully. "It's quite a true story," Tyler corrected. "The question is what you plan to do about it." Patricia looked around the reception hall, seeing 300 guests watching her response, phones recording every word, social media already buzzing with hashtags that could define her family's reputation for generations. She was trapped, and everyone in the room knew it. "Well," Patricia said with forced cheer, "if Ruth has been working to protect innocent people from financial criminals, then obviously the family supports her completely." The words tasted like poison, but they were the only escape route Tyler had left her. "Excellent," Tyler said with satisfaction. "Then I'm sure you'll want to make sure she feels welcome and appreciated at future family gatherings." It was a command disguised as a suggestion, and Patricia understood perfectly. "Of course," she agreed through gritted teeth, but Ruth could see the calculation in Patricia's eyes. This wasn't over. This was a tactical retreat before a more devastating counterattack. Because Patricia Sullivan was exactly the kind of enemy who preferred revenge served cold. Chapter 5. The Price of Truth. When cornered animals attack, they aim for the throat, and Patricia Sullivan was about to prove why she'd never lost a social war in 4 decades of Manhattan combat. The reception hall had divided into factions as surely as if battle lines had been drawn across the marble floor. On one side stood Tyler and Ruth, protected by the armor of his revelations and the shield of federal authority. On the other gathered the Sullivan family, wounded but not defeated, calculating their next move with the precision of generals planning a siege. Michael appeared at Patricia's side like a summoned soldier, his face cycling through confusion, betrayal, and dawning rage as he processed the implications of Tyler's exposé. "Wait," Michael said, his voice cutting through the crowd's murmur. "Are you telling me that my wife of 3 years has been lying about everything? Her name, her past, her entire identity?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Ruth felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Tyler's defense had transformed her from criminal to hero, but it couldn't erase the fundamental truth that she'd built their marriage on deception. "She created a new identity to protect herself from retaliation," Tyler said carefully. "She lied to me," Michael corrected, his voice rising. "For 3 years, she lied about who she was, where she came from, what she'd done. How am I supposed to trust anything about our relationship?" Ruth felt her heart breaking as she watched her husband process the magnitude of her deception. She'd known this moment would come eventually, but she'd hoped to control the circumstances, to explain her choices before having them exposed in front of 300 strangers. "Michael," she said quietly, "I can explain." "Can you?" Michael's laugh was bitter. "Can you explain why you chose to build our entire marriage on lies? Can you explain why you let me introduce you to my family, my friends, my business associates, when you knew you were living under a false identity?" The pain in his voice was devastating, and Ruth realized that Tyler's protection couldn't shield her from the consequences of her own choices. She was protecting herself, Tyler repeated, but Michael turned on him with fury. "From what? From me? Did she think I would have turned her in if she'd told me the truth?" The question revealed the tragedy at the heart of their marriage. Ruth had been so afraid of rejection that she'd never given Michael the chance to accept her, and now she'd never know whether he would have chosen love over loyalty to his family's expectations. "Answer me," Michael demanded. "Did you think I would have betrayed you?" Ruth looked at her husband, really looked at him, and saw a man whose entire understanding of reality had just been shattered. The woman he'd loved for 3 years didn't exist. The life they'd built together was founded on deception. The family he'd brought her into had been unknowingly harboring a federal fugitive. "I thought you would have been afraid," Ruth said honestly. "Afraid of the complications, the scrutiny, the danger of being associated with someone like me." "Someone like what?" Michael's voice cracked. "Someone brave enough to risk everything to protect innocent people. Someone brilliant enough to outsmart financial criminals. Someone ethical enough to sacrifice her own safety for justice." The words should have been comforting, but Ruth could hear the undertone of betrayal that poisoned everything. "Or did you think I was too weak to handle the truth?" Michael continued. "Too selfish to protect someone I loved? Too shallow to see past your criminal record to the person you really are?" Each question was a knife thrust, precisely placed to cause maximum damage. Ruth realized that Michael's pain was transforming into rage, and rage was making him dangerous. "The person I really am," Ruth repeated slowly, "is someone who stole $4 million from innocent people's retirement accounts. Someone who committed federal crimes and fled from justice. Someone who built her entire life on lies and deception." "That's not who you are," Tyler interjected. But Ruth cut him off. "Yes, it is. Tyler can reframe the story all he wants, but the facts remain the same. I committed crimes. I stole money. I assumed a false identity. I lied to everyone I met for 3 years." Ruth turned to address the crowd of onlookers who were recording every word. "You want to know who Rebecca Lewis really is? She's someone who got caught up in something bigger than she understood and made terrible choices under pressure. She's someone who tried to fix her mistakes but ended up committing worse crimes in the process." Tyler stepped forward with alarm. "Ruth, don't. She's someone who fell in love with a good man and was too afraid of losing him to tell him the truth," Ruth continued. "She's someone who let that man's family treat her like garbage because she thought she deserved it. She's someone who's been hiding from herself as much as from the law." The confession was devastating in its honesty, and Ruth could see its impact rippling through the crowd. Social media was exploding as guests live-streamed the most dramatic society event in recent memory. Patricia seized the moment like a predator, sensing weakness. "So you admit it," Patricia said with vicious satisfaction. "You admit that you deceived our family, infiltrated our social circle, and built your entire relationship with my son on lies." "Yes," Ruth said simply. "You admit that you're a criminal who stole millions of dollars from innocent people. Yes. You admit that you assumed a false identity to evade federal law enforcement." "Yes." Patricia's smile was razor-sharp as she delivered the killing blow. "Then why should anyone believe that you're the hero Tyler claims you are? Why should we trust the word of someone who's spent 3 years proving she's willing to lie about anything?" The logic was devastating because it was unassailable. Ruth had indeed spent 3 years lying about everything fundamental to her identity. Why should anyone believe her version of events over Jonathan Pierce's accusations? "Because," Detective Hayes said, stepping forward with quiet authority, "I can confirm that everything Mr. Jameson has said about Rebecca Lewis is accurate." The intervention was so unexpected that it sent new shockwaves through the crowd. Detective Samantha Hayes, the woman who'd spent 3 years hunting Rebecca Lewis, was publicly confirming Tyler's heroic narrative. "Detective," Patricia said carefully, "are you saying that Mrs. Sullivan, this Rebecca Lewis, isn't a criminal?" "I'm saying that Rebecca Lewis was instrumental in exposing the largest financial crime network in Manhattan's recent history," Hayes replied. "Her work led to the recovery of over $15 million in stolen funds and the prosecution of dozens of criminals." Hayes pulled out her badge and held it up for the crowd to see. I'm also saying that as of tonight, the NYPD is offering Rebecca Lewis our full protection and cooperation. She will not be prosecuted for any activities related to the Morrison case." Ruth stared at Detective Hayes in amazement. The woman who'd been hunting her was not only protecting her but offering her immunity. But Patricia wasn't finished. "How convenient," Patricia said with acid sweetness. "The police arriving just in time to validate this remarkable story. Tell me, Detective, how long have you been planning this little performance?" The accusation was clear. Patricia was suggesting that the entire evening had been orchestrated to trap the Sullivan family into accepting Ruth. "Mrs. Sullivan," Hayes said with dangerous calm, "are you suggesting that I would fabricate evidence or misrepresent an ongoing federal investigation?" "I'm suggesting that the timing is remarkably coincidental," Patricia replied. "My daughter-in-law is exposed as a criminal at my daughter's wedding, and suddenly a detective appears to declare her a hero instead. One might wonder what other arrangements have been made behind the scenes." Patricia turned to address the crowd directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're being asked to believe that a woman who spent 3 years lying about her identity is actually a misunderstood hero. We're being told that federal authorities have been secretly protecting someone they've been publicly hunting. We're expected to accept that this elaborate revelation at my daughter's wedding is merely a coincidence." Patricia's voice rose with righteous indignation. "I submit to you that we're witnessing an elaborate con game designed to legitimize a criminal and destroy a respectable family. I submit that Rebecca Lewis is exactly what she appears to be, a thief who seduced my son to gain access to our social circle." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Patricia was gambling everything on one final attack, betting that the crowd's natural skepticism would overcome Tyler's carefully constructed narrative. "Mrs. Sullivan," Tyler said with deadly calm, "that's a very serious accusation." "It's a very serious situation," Patricia replied, "and I intend to get to the truth, no matter how many people try to stop me." Tyler pulled out his phone and began scrolling through screens with practiced efficiency. "In that case," he said, "perhaps we should examine everyone's commitment to truth and transparency." Tyler's tone carried a warning that made Ruth's blood run cold. Whatever he was about to reveal, it was going to change everything. "Because if we're going to discuss criminal activity and family deception," Tyler continued, "there are some very interesting financial records I'd like to share with this distinguished gathering." Patricia's confident expression flickered with the first hint of fear. "After all," Tyler said with a smile that could have frozen champagne, "glass houses make poor platforms for throwing stones." Chapter 6. The Reckoning. When titans clash, the ground shakes beneath everyone's feet, and Tyler Jameson was about to prove why he'd never lost a financial war in his entire career. The reception hall had become a coliseum where reputations lived or died by the sword of revealed truth. Patricia Sullivan stood at the center of the battlefield, her decades of social dominance finally challenged by an opponent who fought with weapons she'd never learned to wield. Tyler's phone screen glowed like a weapon of mass destruction as he scrolled through documents that could reshape Manhattan's power structure with a single revelation. "Mrs. Sullivan," Tyler said with the courtesy that preceded corporate executions, "since you're so committed to transparency and truth, perhaps you'd like to explain these financial records to our distinguished guests." He turned his phone toward the crowd, projecting the screen onto the reception hall's main display system with the efficiency of someone accustomed to boardroom presentations. Numbers cascaded across the wall in devastating detail: bank statements, wire transfers, corporate filings that painted a picture of systematic corruption spanning decades. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tyler announced, "I present the true financial history of Sullivan and Associates." Ruth watched Patricia's face cycle through emotions: shock at Tyler's preparation, fear at the scope of his evidence, and finally, the cold calculation of someone who'd survived 40 years of Manhattan warfare by never admitting defeat. "What you're seeing," Tyler continued, "is documentation of the largest money laundering operation in Manhattan's recent history. Shell companies, offshore accounts, fraudulent investments, all designed to hide the source and destination of stolen funds." The crowd leaned forward with fascination rather than horror. For Manhattan's elite, financial crime was entertainment rather than outrage, particularly when it involved the destruction of a social rival. "These records show that Patricia Sullivan has been stealing from client trust funds for over 5 years, Tyler said. Elderly investors, pension funds, charitable organizations, anyone who was foolish enough to trust their life savings to Sullivan and Associates." Detective Hayes moved closer to the display, her professional instincts engaged by evidence of crimes she could actually prosecute. Tyler continued, "The total amount stolen exceeds $12 million, money that was supposed to secure retirements, fund medical treatments, and support families in their most vulnerable moments." Patricia finally found her voice. "This is fabricated. These documents are forgeries designed to destroy my reputation." "Are they?" Tyler asked with mock surprise. "Because I obtained them directly from federal banking databases. Detective Hayes, would you mind authenticating these records?" Hayes examined the projected documents with the trained eye of someone who'd spent years tracking financial crimes. "These appear to be genuine federal banking records," she said. "If accurate, they would constitute evidence of multiple felonies." "They're accurate," Tyler confirmed. "In fact, I have additional documentation showing how Mrs. Sullivan used her son's marriage to gain access to new victim pools." Michael's face went white as Tyler's implication became clear. "You see," Tyler explained, "marrying Michael to someone with apparent marketing expertise gave Patricia access to new social circles, charity galas, fundraising events, board meetings, all opportunities to identify potential victims with substantial assets and minimal financial sophistication." Ruth felt sick as she realized the true scope of Patricia's manipulation. Her marriage to Michael hadn't just been about social climbing. It had been about expanding Patricia's criminal operations. Ruth's apparent financial knowledge, Tyler continued, made her the perfect accomplice, whether she knew it or not. Patricia could use her daughter-in-law's insights to identify vulnerable targets and design more sophisticated theft schemes. The revelation hit Ruth like a physical blow. For 3 years, she'd thought Patricia's cruelty was about social prejudice. Instead, it had been about criminal exploitation. "That's impossible," Michael said weakly. "My mother would never—" "Your mother has been using you as bait for 3 years, Tyler said bluntly. "Every charity event you attended, every social gathering you hosted, every business dinner where you brought Ruth, it was all designed to give Patricia access to new victims." Tyler's phone showed additional evidence, guest lists, cross-referenced with subsequent financial losses, timing patterns that revealed systematic targeting, wire transfers that coincided with social events. "The beautiful irony," Tyler observed, "is that Patricia spent 3 years trying to drive away the one person who could have exposed her crimes immediately." He turned to Ruth with something resembling admiration. Rebecca Lewis had the skills and knowledge to identify Patricia's schemes within weeks of joining the family. But she was so focused on hiding her own past that she never examined her new family's financial activities. Ruth realized Tyler was right. She'd been so afraid of exposure that she'd ignored obvious signs of the very crimes she'd spent years fighting. "Detective Hayes," Tyler said, "I believe you'll find these records provide sufficient evidence for federal prosecution on charges of money laundering, embezzlement, wire fraud, and racketeering." Hayes was already making notes and speaking quietly into her radio. Federal law enforcement was mobilizing in response to Tyler's evidence dump, but Patricia Sullivan wasn't finished fighting. "You want to play this game?" she said with vicious desperation. "Fine, let's talk about truth and transparency." Patricia's voice rose to carry across the reception hall. "Tyler Jameson has been stalking my daughter-in-law for months. He hired private investigators to dig into her background. He's been manipulating tonight's events to destroy our family and steal Ruth away from my son." The accusation was devastating because it contained enough truth to be believable. Tyler had indeed been investigating Ruth, and his intervention tonight could be interpreted as romantic rather than ethical motivation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Patricia continued, "you're witnessing an elaborate seduction disguised as heroic revelation. Tyler Jameson has orchestrated this entire evening to justify breaking up my son's marriage and claiming Ruth for himself." The crowd's fascination shifted as Patricia reframed the narrative. Instead of watching justice being served, they were now witnessing a love triangle played out on the stage of financial crime. "Think about it," Patricia pressed her advantage. "Why would Tyler Jameson, heir to billions, be so invested in protecting a convicted criminal unless he had personal motivations? Why would he have spent months investigating her unless he was obsessed? Why would he destroy his own wedding reception unless he was desperate to possess her?" Ruth felt the tide of public opinion shifting as Patricia's accusations found their mark. Tyler's protection could indeed be interpreted as stalking, his investigation as obsession, his defense as manipulation. Ashley finally spoke, her voice breaking with the weight of realized betrayal. "Tyler," she said, "tell me this isn't true. Tell me you didn't marry me while being in love with Ruth." The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Tyler's answer would determine not just his marriage's survival, but the credibility of everything he'd revealed tonight. Tyler looked at his wife of 6 hours, and Ruth could see the exact moment when he chose truth over preservation. "Ashley," he said gently, "I've been in love with Ruth since the first time I met her." The confession detonated like a bomb in the reception hall. Ashley's face crumpled with devastation, Patricia's smile turned triumphant, and Michael's expression transformed into something approaching murder. "But," Tyler continued, "that doesn't change the fact that your mother is a criminal who belongs in federal prison." It was the nuclear option. Tyler was sacrificing his marriage to maintain his attack on Patricia's crimes. Ruth realized she was watching a man choose justice over personal happiness in real time. "Detective Hayes," Tyler said, turning away from his devastated wife, "do you have enough evidence to make arrests?" Hayes looked around the reception hall, seeing 300 witnesses to confessions that would fuel federal prosecutions for years. "Yes," she said simply. "Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan, you're under arrest." As federal agents appeared from the crowd's edges, they'd been positioned throughout the reception, Ruth realized. Patricia made one final desperate play. "Ruth," she called out as handcuffs appeared, "tell them the truth. Tell them you're Rebecca Lewis, the criminal, not the hero. Tell them Tyler is lying to protect you because he's obsessed." Ruth looked at the woman who'd made her life miserable for 3 years, who'd been using her to expand criminal operations, who was now demanding that Ruth destroy herself to save Patricia from the consequences of her own choices. "Patricia," Ruth said clearly, "go to hell." As Patricia Sullivan was led away in handcuffs, still screaming accusations and denials, Ruth realized that her old life was finally completely over. But she had no idea what her new life would look like, or whether Tyler's love was salvation or simply a more beautiful prison. Chapter 7. The Aftermath. Freedom tastes different when it's mixed with loss, and Ruth Washington was about to discover the true cost of truth. The Plaza Hotel's reception hall had transformed into a crime scene disguised as a social gathering. Federal agents moved through the crowd with professional efficiency, taking statements and gathering evidence, while Manhattan's elite watched their entertainment evolve into something resembling actual consequence. Ruth stood in the center of the chaos, feeling strangely disconnected from the drama swirling around her. Patricia and Robert Sullivan were being processed by federal marshals, their handcuffs glinting under crystal chandeliers like jewelry made of shame. Michael sat slumped in a gilded chair, staring at nothing as his entire understanding of reality crumbled. Ashley sobbed into her wedding dress, $50,000 of silk and pearls reduced to an expensive tissue for tears of betrayal. Detective Hayes approached Ruth with an expression that mixed professional satisfaction with personal regret. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'm sorry, Ms. Lewis. We'll need you to come in for formal debriefing," Hayes said. "But I want you to know that everything Mr. Jameson said tonight was accurate. You're not being charged with any crimes related to the Morrison case." Ruth nodded numbly. "Thank you. The federal prosecutor will want to discuss your testimony against the Sullivans, but that's voluntary. You're free to go." Free. The word should have felt liberating, but Ruth only felt empty. After 3 years of hiding, 3 years of fear, 3 years of carefully constructed lies, she was finally free to be herself. She just wasn't sure who that was anymore. Tyler appeared beside her, having escaped from the federal agents who'd been questioning him about his evidence gathering. His wedding tuxedo was rumpled, his perfect hair disheveled, his face showing the strain of watching his marriage die in front of 300 witnesses. "Ruth," he said quietly, "we need to talk." She looked at this man who'd sacrificed everything to protect her, who'd destroyed his own wedding to expose the truth, who'd confessed to loving her in the most public way possible. "Do we?" she asked. Tyler's expression showed surprise and hurt. "I thought, after everything that happened tonight." "After everything that happened tonight, your marriage is over, my marriage is over, and 2 people are going to federal prison," Ruth said. "What exactly do you think we need to discuss?" Tyler stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I think we need to discuss what happens next. Where you're going to live, how you're going to rebuild your life, whether you want my help with any of it." Ruth studied Tyler's face, seeing genuine concern mixed with something that looked suspiciously like ownership. He'd protected her, saved her, transformed her from criminal to hero with the power of his narrative and evidence. But she was beginning to wonder what price that protection would carry. "Tyler," she said carefully, "why did you really do all this?" "What do you mean?" "I mean the investigation, the evidence gathering, the coordination with federal authorities. You've been planning this for months, maybe years. Why?" Tyler was quiet for a long moment, and Ruth could see him choosing his words carefully. "Because you saved my mother's life," he said finally. "When you recovered the money Morrison stole from her retirement account, you gave her back the resources she needed for cancer treatment. She's alive because of what you did." It was the same explanation he'd given before, but Ruth sensed there was more to it. "And," she prompted. Tyler's expression grew uncomfortable. "And because I've been in love with you for 2 years, and I wanted to find a way to free you from the life you were trapped in." There it was, the truth beneath the heroic narrative. Tyler hadn't just been seeking justice. He'd been orchestrating Ruth's liberation so he could claim her for himself. "So this was all about possession," Ruth said. "No," Tyler said quickly. "It was about giving you choices. Before tonight, you were trapped by fear and false identity. Now you're free to be yourself, to use your skills openly, to build whatever life you want. With you. If that's what you choose." Ruth looked around the reception hall, seeing the wreckage of multiple lives scattered across marble floors. Michael was being questioned by federal agents about his knowledge of his parents' crimes. Ashley was surrounded by bridesmaids, trying to comfort her through the worst night of her life. Wedding guests were live-streaming the drama to social media feeds that would immortalize this disaster forever. "Tyler," Ruth said, "look around. Look at what your protection cost." "It cost what it needed to cost," Tyler replied without hesitation. Patricia Sullivan was destroying innocent people's lives. She needed to be stopped. And Michael? Ashley? Did they need to be destroyed too? Tyler's expression hardened. Michael chose to enable his mother's crimes by willful ignorance. Ashley chose to attack you rather than question her family's treatment of an innocent person. They made their choices. Ruth realized Tyler was completely without regret for the collateral damage his justice had caused. In his mind, everyone had gotten exactly what they deserved. It was terrifying in its certainty. "What about your choices?" Ruth asked. "You married Ashley while being in love with me. You used your wedding as a trap to expose her family. You destroyed multiple lives to save one." "To save yours," Tyler corrected. "And yes, I'd do it again." The confession was both romantic and disturbing. Tyler was declaring his willingness to destroy anyone who threatened Ruth, which should have been comforting, but instead felt like a cage made of good intentions. Before Ruth could respond, Michael appeared beside them with federal agents flanking him like an honor guard of consequences. "Ruth," Michael said, his voice hollow with exhaustion and betrayal, "I need to ask you something." She turned to face her husband of 3 years, seeing a broken man who'd lost his family, his fortune, and his understanding of reality in the span of a single evening. "Did you ever love me?" Michael asked. "Even a little? Or was our entire marriage just part of your cover story?" The question was devastating in its vulnerability. Michael Sullivan, privileged, powerful, protected by wealth and social position, was asking whether he'd ever mattered to the woman who'd shared his bed for 3 years. Ruth looked at this man who'd failed her when she needed him most, who'd chosen his family's approval over her dignity, who'd publicly abandoned her rather than defend her. But she also saw the man who'd made her laugh on lonely nights, who'd held her during nightmares about Detective Hayes finding her, who'd genuinely tried to love her within the limitations of his own courage. "Yes," Ruth said quietly. "I loved you. I loved the man I thought you were, and I loved the man you tried to be. I just couldn't love you enough to keep pretending to be someone else." Michael nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. "And Tyler?" Michael asked. "Do you love him?" Ruth looked at Tyler, seeing intelligence, strength, protection, and power. She saw a man who'd sacrificed everything to free her, who'd loved her enough to wage war against her enemies, who offered her a partnership that could change the world. She also saw a man who'd orchestrated tonight's revelations to claim her, who'd destroyed lives to prove his love, who wanted to possess her as much as protect her. "I don't know," Ruth said honestly. Tyler's expression showed pain but not surprise. "Fair enough. You don't have to know tonight." "But you hope I'll figure it out in your favor," Ruth observed. Tyler's smile was rueful. "Yes, I hope you'll give us a chance to build something real together." Ruth realized she was standing at a crossroads that would define the rest of her life. She could choose Tyler and accept the protection, power, and partnership he offered. She could try to reconcile with Michael and rebuild their marriage on a foundation of truth rather than lies. Or she could choose herself and face an uncertain future alone. The federal agents were finishing their preliminary interviews, and the crowd was beginning to disperse as the evening's entertainment reached its natural conclusion. Soon, Ruth would have to leave the Plaza Hotel and decide where to go next. For the first time in 3 years, she could go anywhere she wanted. The question was whether she was brave enough to choose freedom over protection, uncertainty over security, herself over everyone who claimed to love her. Ruth looked at Tyler one more time, seeing the future he offered, powerful, protected, but potentially imprisoned by his good intentions. Then she looked at Michael, seeing the past they'd shared, loving but limited, honest but insufficient. Finally, she looked toward the hotel's exit, seeing the unknown future that waited beyond the safety of other people's plans for her life. Ruth Washington, Rebecca Lewis, made her choice. Chapter 8. The Choice. Independence tastes like fear mixed with possibility, and Ruth Washington was about to discover whether she was strong enough to choose herself over everyone who claimed to love her. The Plaza Hotel lobby felt like neutral territory between the wreckage of her old life and the uncertainty of whatever came next. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan pulsed with its usual late-night energy, taxis weaving through traffic, neon signs painting the sidewalks in electric colors, and 8 million people pursuing their own versions of survival and success. Ruth sat alone on an antique velvet sofa, watching Tyler pace near the concierge desk while speaking urgently into his phone. Federal agents, legal representatives, and crisis management specialists swirled around him like satellites orbiting a powerful star. Even in the aftermath of personal disaster, Tyler Jameson commanded resources that could reshape reality to his preferences. Detective Hayes approached with the measured pace of someone who'd spent the evening watching her 3-year investigation conclude in the most dramatic way possible. "Ms. Lewis," Hayes said, settling into the adjacent chair, "I owe you an explanation." Ruth looked at the woman who'd haunted her nightmares for 3 years. "Do you?" "I've known you weren't the real criminal in the Morrison case for over a year," Hayes said. "The evidence Tyler presented tonight wasn't news to me. It was confirmation of conclusions I'd already reached." Ruth felt her understanding of reality shift again. "You've known I was innocent for a year?" "I've known you were more victim than perpetrator," Hayes corrected. "Your initial involvement was criminal, but your subsequent actions suggested someone trying to right wrongs rather than profit from them." Hayes pulled out a small notebook and began reading from precise handwritten notes. Morrison's bank records showed systematic theft spanning 4 years. Your employment records showed you worked there for 18 months. The timeline didn't match. Someone was stealing before you arrived and continued after you left. Ruth stared at Detective Hayes, realizing the woman had been building a case for her innocence while seeming to hunt her. "But you never contacted me," Ruth said. "Because you were safer as Ruth Washington than you would have been as Rebecca Lewis under federal protection," Hayes replied. "The people Morrison was laundering money for don't forgive and forget. Staying hidden was your best chance of staying alive." Hayes glanced toward Tyler, who was still orchestrating damage control with military precision. "Until Mr. Jameson decided to play White Knight," she added with obvious disapproval. "You don't approve of what he did?" Hayes's expression was carefully neutral. "I don't approve of civilians conducting vigilante investigations that interfere with ongoing federal operations. But I can't argue with his results. We now have enough evidence to dismantle a money laundering network we've been tracking for 5 years. The Sullivan family was part of something larger. The Sullivan family was a small piece of a much larger puzzle," Hayes confirmed. "Their arrests tonight will probably trigger 20 more arrests across 3 states. Tyler's evidence gathering was thorough to the point of obsession." The word obsession hung in the air between them, and Ruth realized Detective Hayes was warning her about something. "Detective," Ruth said carefully, "what do you think Tyler wants from me?" Hayes was quiet for a long moment, watching Tyler coordinate with his team of advisors and assistants. "I think Tyler Jameson is a man who's accustomed to getting what he wants," Hayes said finally. "And I think he's decided he wants you." "That's not necessarily a bad thing." "No," Hayes agreed. "But it's not necessarily a good thing either. Powerful men who rescue women often expect gratitude to look like submission." Before Ruth could respond, Tyler approached with the kind of focused energy that had made him one of Manhattan's most successful businessmen before his 30th birthday. "Ruth," he said, "I've arranged a suite at the St. Regis for tonight. Tomorrow we can discuss longer-term arrangements." "No," Ruth interrupted. Tyler's expression showed surprise and something that might have been irritation. "I'm sorry. I said no. I don't need you to arrange my accommodations." Tyler glanced at Detective Hayes, as if seeking support for his reasonable offer, then back to Ruth. "Ruth, you can't go back to the apartment you shared with Michael. The media is probably already camped outside, and you'll need security while we sort out the federal witness protection protocols." "Tyler," Ruth said, standing up to face him directly. "Stop." The word carried enough authority to make Tyler pause his rapid-fire planning. "I appreciate everything you did tonight," Ruth continued. "You saved my life, exposed the truth, and gave me freedom I didn't think I could ever have. But I'm not your responsibility." Tyler's expression cycled through confusion, hurt, and dawning alarm. "I never said you were my responsibility," he said. "I'm offering to help someone I care about." "You're offering to manage someone you've decided belongs to you," Ruth corrected. "There's a difference." Detective Hayes rose from her chair with the expression of someone who'd seen this conversation play out many times before. "I'm going to give you two some privacy," Hayes said. "Ms. Lewis, my card has my direct number. Call me when you've decided what you want your future to look like." As Hayes walked away, Tyler stepped closer to Ruth with the intensity of someone who'd just realized his carefully laid plans were unraveling. "Ruth, I don't understand. I thought after tonight, after everything I did to free you, we could finally be together." "Together," Ruth repeated. "On your terms, in accommodations you arrange, with security you provide, living a life you've planned for me." Tyler's expression showed genuine confusion. "I'm trying to protect you." "You're trying to own me," Ruth said. "The same way you owned tonight's revelations, the same way you owned the destruction of the Sullivan family, the same way you owned your own wedding ceremony right up until you used it as a weapon." The accusations hit Tyler like physical blows, and Ruth could see him processing the implications of her resistance. "I love you," Tyler said, and his voice carried the bewilderment of someone who'd never had love refused before. "I know you do," Ruth replied, "but your love feels like another cage, Tyler. Beautiful, comfortable, protected, but still a cage." Tyler was quiet for a long moment, and Ruth could see him running calculations behind his eyes. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally. "I want you to let me figure out what I want for myself," Ruth said. "I want you to stop planning my life and start asking what I need. I want you to love me enough to let me choose you instead of manipulating circumstances so I have no other options." Tyler nodded slowly, and Ruth could see him filing away information for future strategic use. "Okay," he said. "What do you need right now?" Ruth looked around the plaza's opulent lobby, seeing the life of privilege and protection that Tyler offered, then looked toward the hotel's exit, seeing the uncertain freedom that waited beyond. "I need to leave," Ruth said. "Alone. I need to figure out who Rebecca Lewis is when she's not hiding, not being protected, not being managed by someone else's good intentions." Tyler's expression showed pain, but not surprise. "Where will you go?" "I don't know yet," Ruth admitted. "But I'll figure it out." "And us?" Ruth looked at this man who'd sacrificed everything to save her, who loved her enough to wage war against her enemies, who offered partnership and protection and a life of consequence. "Ask me again in 6 months," she said, "when I know who I am without your help." Tyler nodded, and Ruth could see him accepting her decision with the grace of someone who'd learned when to fight and when to wait. 6 months, he agreed. Ruth walked toward the plaza's exit, feeling the weight of 3 years of hidden identity lifting from her shoulders with each step. Behind her, Tyler's voice called out one last time. "Ruth." She turned back to see him standing alone among the marble columns and crystal fixtures, looking smaller somehow, without his armor of certainty and control. "Be careful," he said simply. Ruth smiled, the first genuine smile she'd managed all evening. "Tyler," she said, "I'm Rebecca Lewis. Careful is what I do." As Ruth stepped out into Manhattan's neon-lit chaos, she realized she was completely free for the first time in her adult life, free from the fear of discovery, free from the weight of deception, free from the need to be anyone other than herself. The question was, who exactly was she when she wasn't running from her past or hiding behind someone else's protection? Ruth Washington, Rebecca Lewis, walked into the night to find out. Chapter 9. The breaking point. The phone call came at dawn, and Ruth Washington learned that sometimes freedom's greatest enemy is the person you used to love. Ruth had spent the night in a modest hotel in Queens, paying cash and using identification documents she'd kept hidden for 3 years, emergency measures for emergencies that had finally arrived. The room was small, clean, and anonymous, exactly what someone needed when starting over with nothing but their own strength. She'd slept better than she had in months. But at 6:47 a.m., her phone shattered the peace with a ringtone she'd learned to dread. "Ruth." Ashley's voice was hoarse from crying, raw with exhaustion and fury. "We need to talk." Ruth sat up in the narrow bed, instantly alert. Ashley Sullivan Jameson, former bride, current divorcee, and Ruth's sister-in-law for exactly 24 more hours until the marriage annulment papers were finalized. "Ashley," Ruth said carefully, "how did you get this number? Does it matter?" Ashley's laugh held no humor. "I want to meet. 1 hour? The coffee shop where you met my brother." The location was deliberate, chosen to remind Ruth of everything she was destroying by refusing to play her assigned role in other people's narratives. "Ashley, I don't think—" "1 hour," Ashley repeated, and the line went dead. Ruth stared at her phone, recognizing a trap but unable to ignore it. Ashley was destroyed, abandoned, and dangerous, exactly the kind of person who made unpredictable decisions that could devastate everyone around her. 45 minutes later, Ruth walked into the small cafe in Midtown where she'd first met Michael 3 years ago. Ashley sat at a corner table, still wearing yesterday's wedding dress, $50,000 worth of silk and pearls, now wrinkled and stained with tears, makeup, and the residue of a life that had imploded in real time. She looked like a beautiful ghost haunting the scene of her own funeral. "You came," Ashley said as Ruth approached. "You knew I would." Ashley gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Sit, please." Ruth remained standing. "Ashley, what do you want?" "I want to understand," Ashley said, her voice carrying the bewilderment of someone whose entire understanding of reality had been shattered. "I want to understand how you destroyed my family, my marriage, and my life, and everyone thinks you're the hero." Ruth pulled out the chair and sat down, recognizing that Ashley needed this conversation more than she needed Ruth's cooperation. "I didn't destroy your family," Ruth said gently. "Your mother's crimes destroyed your family. Tyler's investigation exposed it. I was just there when it happened." Ashley's eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, the eyes of someone who'd spent the night confronting truths too large to process. "My parents are going to federal prison," Ashley said. "My brother's marriage is over. My own marriage lasted 6 hours. Tyler used our wedding as a trap to destroy everyone I care about." Ruth felt a stab of sympathy for the woman who'd slapped her 12 hours earlier. "Ashley, I'm sorry." "Are you?" Ashley interrupted. "Are you really sorry? Because from where I'm sitting, you got everything you wanted. Tyler destroyed my family to protect you. He chose you over me on our wedding day. He threw away our marriage because he's obsessed with you." The accusation hung between them like a weapon waiting to be fired. "I didn't ask Tyler to do any of that," Ruth said. "Didn't you?" Ashley leaned forward with predatory intensity. Didn't you spend 3 years playing the victim, making Tyler feel sorry for you, manipulating him into believing you needed rescuing? Ruth studied Ashley's face, seeing grief transforming into rage, love curdling into hatred with the speed of chemical reaction. Ashley, Tyler made his own choices. Tyler made choices based on lies you told him, Ashley corrected. You convinced him you were some kind of misunderstood hero instead of a criminal who seduced my brother for protection. Ashley pulled out her phone and began scrolling through screens with manic energy. Do you want to know what I've been doing all night? Research. Real research into Rebecca Lewis and the Morrison case. Ruth felt ice forming in her chest. Turns out the internet remembers everything, Ashley continued. Financial records, news articles, federal documents. All publicly available if you know where to look. Ashley turned her phone toward Ruth, showing financial documents that made Ruth's blood run cold. According to federal banking records, Rebecca Lewis stole $4.2 million from Morrison and Associates clients, Ashley read. The money was never recovered. Morrison claimed she was the mastermind behind a scheme that destroyed dozens of families. Ruth stared at the documents, recognizing the selective truth that could damn her more effectively than any lie. Those records don't tell the whole story, Ruth said. Don't they? Ashley's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. Because according to this, you disappeared with stolen money 3 days before federal agents raided Morrison's office. That sounds less like heroic whistleblowing and more like criminal flight. Ashley scrolled to another screen. Here's my favorite part, she continued. Financial analysis suggests the money was moved to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, standard money laundering procedure for international criminals. Ruth realized Ashley had found the one version of events that made her look guilty while ignoring evidence of her innocence. Ashley, you're only seeing part of the picture. I'm seeing the part Tyler chose to ignore because he's obsessed with you, Ashley interrupted. I'm seeing evidence that you're exactly what my mother said you were, a criminal who seduced my brother to gain access to our social circle. Ashley leaned back in her chair with the satisfaction of someone who'd found the weapon she needed. But here's what's really interesting, she continued. All of Tyler's evidence about my mother's supposed crimes, all of it comes from sources connected to you. Financial records you could have falsified, witness statements from people in your network, documentation that appeared just in time to destroy my family. Ruth felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as Ashley constructed an alternate narrative that painted Tyler as Rebecca's dupe and the Sullivan family as her victims. You're suggesting I framed your parents? I'm suggesting you manipulated Tyler into framing my parents, Ashley corrected. I'm suggesting you spent 3 years positioning yourself to destroy anyone who questioned your cover story. Ashley's phone buzzed with an incoming message, and her expression shifted to something approaching satisfaction. Actually, she said, I'm not just suggesting it. I'm proving it. Ashley turned her phone to show Ruth a contact list that made her heart stop. Turns out social media makes it really easy to find people, Ashley said, especially people who lost money in the Morrison case and might be interested in revenge against the woman who stole it. Ruth recognized several names from her past, victims whose lives had been destroyed by Morrison's schemes, people who'd spent years hunting for someone to blame. What did you do? Ruth asked. Ashley's smile was triumphant. I told them where to find Rebecca Lewis. The words hit Ruth like a physical blow. Ashley had weaponized the internet to expose Ruth's location to people who had every reason to want her dead. Ashley, those people are dangerous. Those people are victims, Ashley corrected. Victims of crimes you committed. Victims who deserve justice. Ruth's phone began buzzing with unknown numbers, and she realized Ashley's revelation was already spreading through networks of people who'd been hunting her for years. "You have no idea what you've done," Ruth said. "I've leveled the playing field," Ashley replied. "Tyler used his resources to destroy my family. Now you get to face people who have resources of their own and every reason to use them against you." Ashley stood up, smoothing down her ruined wedding dress with hands that shook slightly from exhaustion and adrenaline. "Enjoy your freedom, Rebecca," she said. "I hope it's everything you thought it would be." As Ashley walked toward the cafe's exit, Ruth realized her new life had just become a matter of survival rather than self-discovery. Her phone continued buzzing with threatening messages, angry voices, and promises of retribution from people who'd spent years dreaming of revenge against Rebecca Lewis. Tyler's protection had kept her safe from consequences she'd never fully understood. Now she was about to learn exactly how dangerous freedom could be. Chapter 10. The coffee that changes everything. Sometimes salvation arrives in the form of bitter truth served in chipped cups, and Ruth Washington was about to discover that the strongest foundations are built on the ruins of everything you thought you wanted. The morning sun painted Manhattan's skyline in shades of gold and shadow as Ruth sat alone at the same table where her marriage had begun 3 years ago. The cafe was different now, smaller, shabbier, populated by early commuters grabbing caffeine before facing another day in the city that never forgave weakness. Her phone lay silent on the scarred wooden table, finally quiet after 6 hours of threatening calls, angry messages, and digital harassment from people who'd spent years wanting someone to blame for their financial losses. Ashley's revelation had spread through victim networks with viral efficiency, turning Ruth from hero to target in the span of a single night. She'd learned to turn off notifications. At exactly 7 o'clock, the cafe door opened to admit the one person Ruth had been both hoping and dreading to see. Tyler Jameson looked like he hadn't slept in days. His usually perfect appearance was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled, his face showing the strain of watching everything he'd carefully constructed collapse in real time. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he'd spent the night dealing with the consequences of Ashley's digital warfare. "Is this seat taken?" Tyler asked, echoing the words he'd spoken at his own wedding reception 12 hours earlier. Ruth didn't look up from her coffee. She simply pushed out the chair across from her with her foot, the same gesture she'd made for Michael 3 years ago, the same gesture she'd made for Tyler the night before. Tyler sat down heavily and signaled the waitress for coffee with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion and stress. The silence stretched between them like a minefield where any word could trigger devastation. Finally, Ruth spoke. "Ashley found me." "I know," Tyler said quietly. "My security team's been monitoring the situation since 3 a.m. Ruth looked up at him for the first time since he'd arrived. "Your security team?" "Private investigators, cybersecurity specialists, threat assessment analysts," Tyler replied. "People who make problems disappear when they threaten things I care about." Tyler's coffee arrived, but he ignored it, focusing entirely on Ruth with the intensity of someone trying to solve an impossible equation. "Ruth, I can fix this," he said. "I can trace the harassment back to its sources, neutralize the threats, make it clear that attacking you means dealing with resources most people can't imagine." "Stop!" Ruth interrupted. Tyler blinked as if she'd slapped him. "What? Stop trying to fix this. Stop trying to protect me. Stop trying to manage my life." Ruth's voice was steady, but carried an exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. "Tyler, do you know what I realized last night while strangers called my phone to tell me how they wanted to kill me?" Tyler shook his head, his expression showing genuine confusion. I realize that I've spent my entire adult life being managed by other people's good intentions, Ruth continued. Morrison managed my career until I became complicit in his crimes. You managed my rescue until I became dependent on your protection. Even Ashley is trying to manage my destruction. Tyler leaned forward with the desperate energy of someone watching something precious slip away. Ruth, that's not fair. I didn't manage your rescue. I gave you choices. You gave me the choices you wanted me to have, Ruth corrected. You orchestrated circumstances so I would choose you over Michael, freedom over security, partnership over dependence, but they were still your choices, disguised as mine. Tyler was quiet for a long moment, and Ruth could see him processing the implications of her accusation. So what do you want? He asked finally. I want to choose myself, Ruth said simply. I want to face the consequences of my own actions without someone else's protection. I want to succeed or fail based on my own strength, not someone else's resources. Tyler's expression cycled through bewilderment, hurt, and finally something that looked like respect. Even if it means facing death threats from people who want revenge. Especially then, Ruth replied, because running from consequences is what got me into this mess in the first place. Ruth pulled out an envelope and placed it on the table between them, the same gesture she'd made with Michael the day before, but this time the contents were different. What's that? Tyler asked. A business proposal, Ruth said. The Lewis Foundation for Financial Justice, non-profit organization dedicated to helping victims of financial crimes recover their losses and holding perpetrators accountable. Tyler stared at the envelope as if it might explode. I'm going to use my skills publicly, Ruth continued. No more hiding, no more false identities, no more letting other people manage my conscience. Rebecca Lewis is going to fix the problems Rebecca Lewis helped create. Tyler opened the envelope and began reading with the focused attention of someone who'd spent his career analyzing business documents. This is comprehensive, he said with obvious surprise. Corporate structure, funding mechanisms, operational protocols. Ruth, this is brilliant. Thank you. But it's also incredibly dangerous. Going public means accepting responsibility for crimes people still blame you for. It means facing lawsuits, criminal investigations, death threats from people who'll never forgive you. Ruth sipped her coffee, tasting the bitter truth of choices made without safety nets. It also means having the chance to make things right, she said. To use my knowledge to help people instead of hide from them. To build something meaningful instead of just surviving. Tyler continued reading, and Ruth could see him recognizing the magnitude of what she was proposing. The foundation would need significant funding, he observed. Millions of dollars in startup capital, ongoing operational expenses, legal protection for staff and clients. I know, Ruth interrupted, which brings me to the partnership offer. Tyler looked up from the documents with hope flickering in his exhausted eyes. Partnership? Business partnership, Ruth clarified. Equal partners, equal decision-making authority, equal responsibility for success or failure. The Jameson Lewis Foundation for Financial Justice. Tyler was quiet for a long moment, studying Ruth's face as if trying to read a foreign language. What about us? He asked finally. What about the personal relationship? Ruth felt her heart breaking for this man who'd sacrificed everything to save her, who deserved better than the uncertainty she was offering. Ask me again in a year, she said, when we know whether we can work together as equals instead of protector and protected. When I know who I am without your help. When you know whether you love Rebecca Lewis or just the idea of saving her. Tyler nodded slowly, and Ruth could see him accepting terms that were less than he wanted, but more than he'd feared. A year, he agreed. Ruth stood up, leaving money on the table for both their coffees, a small gesture of independence that felt enormous in its implications. Tyler, she said, I'm going to walk out of here and face whatever consequences are waiting for me, alone. If you follow me, if you send security teams, if you try to protect me from the choices I'm making, then I'll know you don't respect me enough to be my partner in anything." Tyler looked up at her with an expression that mixed admiration, terror, and love in equal proportions. "Ruth," he said, "be careful." Ruth smiled. The same words he'd spoken the night before, but this time they carried blessing instead of ownership. "Tyler," she replied, "I'm Rebecca Lewis. Careful is what I'm learning not to be." As Ruth walked toward the cafe's exit, she realized she was stepping into the most dangerous period of her life. Ashley's digital attack had painted a target on her back that could attract killers, federal investigators, and vengeful victims who'd spent years dreaming of revenge. But she was also stepping into the most honest period of her life. No more hiding, no more lies, no more dependence on other people's protection. For the first time since she'd stolen her first dollar from Gerald Morrison's accounts, Rebecca Lewis was going to face the world as herself. The woman who'd built an empire from stolen money was about to discover whether she could build something meaningful from truth. Rebecca Lewis, no longer Ruth Washington, no longer anyone's victim or protector or project, walked into the Manhattan morning to find out who she really was when she stopped running from herself. 6 months later, the Lewis Foundation for Financial Justice had recovered over $50 million in stolen assets for victims of financial crimes and exposed 12 major fraud schemes across 4 states. A year later, Tyler Jameson asked Rebecca Lewis to marry him at the same coffee shop where she'd chosen herself over his protection. She said yes, not because she needed saving, but because she'd learned the difference between love that liberates and love that imprisons. Some stories end with rescue. The best ones begin with choosing yourself. The end. Epilogue. 2 years after their wedding, Rebecca Lewis and Tyler Jameson testified before Congress about financial crime prevention, leading to legislation that protected millions of retirement accounts from predatory schemes. Michael Sullivan moved to California and opened a legitimate financial planning practice, specializing in helping fraud victims rebuild their lives. Ashley Sullivan was convicted of cyberstalking and sentenced to community service at a financial literacy nonprofit where she discovered a talent for teaching elderly people to protect themselves from scams. Patricia and Robert Sullivan served 18 months in federal prison before being released to house arrest, where they spent their remaining years wondering how they'd raise children strong enough to choose justice over family loyalty. And Rebecca Lewis finally learned that the bravest thing she'd ever done wasn't stealing $4 million to protect innocent people. It was choosing to stop hiding from the woman she'd always been afraid to become.